History says Paul Atreides destroyed 2 empires. History is wrong. He didn't destroy House Harkonnen and House Corrino. He walked into the wreckage of 2 empires that had already collapsed from the inside, years before he arrived, and everyone mistook the sound of the walls finally hitting the ground for the sound of him tearing them down. Baron Vladimir Harkonnen built his entire war on Arrakis around one perfect trap. He waited for years, smiled through a false peace with House Atreides, and paid a trusted doctor to betray Duke Leto from the inside. It worked. Leto died on his knees in a Harkonnen ship, poison gas in his lungs. His last act, a failed assassination attempt on the man who orchestrated his ruin. On paper, that's a masterstroke. In practice, it's the moment the Baron signed his own death warrant, 2 years early, without noticing. Look at who he actually put in charge of holding what he'd won. Not the most capable officer in his ranks, his own nephew, a brute with no talent for governing and no instinct beyond brute force, chosen for exactly one qualification. He was too stupid and too loyal to have a plot against his uncle. That wasn't a bad hire. That was the only kind of hire the Baron's worldview allowed. He never promoted anyone he trusted. He promoted people he believed he could control, because in his mind, every competent subordinate was just a future assassin who hadn't struck yet. Rabban wasn't a mistake. Rabban was the only possible outcome of a house where ambition got you killed, and mediocrity kept you alive. The same paranoia that made him trust no one outside his own bloodline is exactly what left the Baron alone, floating, with no one loyal enough left to warn him a girl carrying a reverend mother's memories was standing close enough to end him with a single needle. The needle killed the Baron. His paranoia killed House Harkonnen. Paul didn't have to defeat that house. He just had to still be standing when it finished collapsing. Shaddam IV made the exact same error from the opposite direction, with much better tailoring. He didn't rule through open cruelty. He ruled through control so total it looked like order. He hid his elite Sardaukar inside Harkonnen uniforms so no massacre could ever be traced back to his throne, which, for a man that obsessed with secrecy, is almost impressive. He kept his own daughter, Irulan, trained, brilliant, and given no real power of her own, because an emperor who fears competence doesn't share it, not even with his blood. But strip away the uniforms and the secrecy, and ask what actually held the Imperium together. Not loyalty to House Corrino, fear of the Sardaukar. The Landsraad didn't follow Shaddam out of devotion. They followed him because opposing him was more expensive than obedience. That's not an empire. That's a threat everyone's too afraid to test. And a threat only works until someone finally calls it. The instant another force appeared that men were willing to die for on belief alone rather than fear alone, the illusion holding the Corrino throne together didn't weaken. It vanished, almost overnight, because it had never been real to begin with. By the time he finally stood in that throne room, the outcome had already been decided somewhere else, years earlier, in 100 small decisions about who to trust and who to silence. Paul didn't overthrow the Emperor. He simply announced that the Emperor had already become irrelevant. Their final mistake explains why both empires collapsed the exact same way. Both men treated belief like paperwork, something you file, not something you survive. The Baron dismissed Fremen prophecy as superstition beneath his notice. Shaddam let the Bene Gesserit spend centuries quietly manufacturing that same prophecy, assuming a legend you plant is a legend you own. Both of them understood armies. Both of them understood spies, bribes, and the mathematics of fear. What neither of them ever understood is what happens the moment ordinary people are handed a cause they'd choose to die for, with nobody forcing them to. That's not a weapon you can buy, or infiltrate, or assassinate your way around. The Baron and the Emperor spent their lives mastering every tool of control, and missed the one force in the Imperium that was never for sale. Fear and control were never power. They were loans. Both men spent decades borrowing against a debt they refused to believe would ever come due. Audits don't create bankruptcy. They reveal it. Paul Atreides didn't burn either empire down. He simply showed up holding the paperwork nobody else had bothered to read. The Sardaukar broke against fighters who believed in something real, against an emperor who had spent his entire reign making sure no one around him was allowed to believe in anything. He didn't lose the Imperium in that throne room. He just found out, in front of everyone, that he'd already lost it. You cannot buy the kind of loyalty that makes a starving desert warrior stand against overwhelming firepower for you. You cannot terrify anyone into that. You cannot manage it through secrecy, or inherit it through bloodline. You have to actually deserve it. And neither of these men ever tried. The Baron didn't lose Arrakis. Shaddam didn't lose the Imperium. They lost both, years before Paul ever learned to ride a sandworm. Paul wasn't the reason their empires died. He was simply the first person alive to notice they already had.